taggy kind of non-critical books, and this one is poetic and very stylish. You know, I don't know if you've read, Mark, those Peter Guralnick Elvis.
Oh, the Elvis one too.
Yeah, that makes me think of that. It's just
cool!
really,
Wow, that's high praise. They're great books.
They are.
You know,
so it's such poetic writing.
For sure, that was an influence. Like I wanted the biography to be as much a work of history, with Nick as the kind of star, but not the only figure of it. And I mean, I'm assuming most people here are here because they love Nick Cave, but there's plenty of people that hate Nick Cave as well. That he seems to provide sort of the ecstasy either way in that regard. But I kind of hope that even people who would hate Nick Cave would be interested in the book because of its historical and cultural information. And even people who had no interest, it's just about that period of Australia from the 60s through to the 80s, and how it sort of, I think, impacted us all, irrespective of your interest in Nick Cave. So yeah, I'd interviewed Nick a number of times and in all kinds of conditions prior to the beginning of the biography. By the time I got to the biography, he was a happily married man, a father, he was clean of heroin, very straight, very alert, very friendly, and a very different guy to the guy I first met back in the kind of early mid-80s. But the book starts, and this is actually not really especially indicative of the book. There are these framing chapters where I use first person and try to explain the connections between Nick and I. And this little extract that I'll read for a couple of minutes is just about the first time I met Nick properly, and that was during his, well, it's fair to say bad old days, but he was certainly involved with taking drugs and pretty kind of out there. And he had a fearsome reputation, but this is the opening preface chapter, The Journalist and the Singer. The first time I ever spoke to Nick Cave was in a phone interview to promote his second solo album, The Firstborn is Dead, an ominous blues-affected work that sanctified the birth of Elvis Presley and thereby rock and roll itself in quasi-religious, apocalyptic terms. It was 1985. Our conversation around the recording was dry as spinifex, so slow and spacious it sometimes ceased to exist. As if Cave could not be less interested in what I was asking or saying, and never would be. Given his notorious hatred of journalists back then, this made for an uphill experience. I put the phone down with sweating palms and a sinking feeling in my heart. What a failure. Dealing with Cave again, let alone meeting him in person, was not something I looked forward to. In 1988, I nonetheless lobbied to interview Nick Cave for Sydney's On the Street. Second time lucky, I must have been hoping. Face to face, he had to be more approachable than that distant voice on an echoing telephone line. Besides, he was the preeminent Australian rock and roll artist of his day. This made him hard to ignore. Cave was in town to read and preview a much anticipated literary work in progress, a book that would become known as And the Ass Saw the Angel. He'd already gone so far as to declare himself more of a writer now, disowning rock and roll for its lowbrow qualities and Pavlov's dog audience responses. I was given a laneway address for a warehouse located directly behind Sydney's somewhat alternative and bohemian gay strip, Oxford Street. Cave was apparently holed up there with a girlfriend or a dealer or a criminal acquaintance. Rumours varied depending on who I spoke to. As always with Cave, rumours were all around him, as if his every movement across town were hot-wired into the gossip chambers of inner city Sydney conversation. The only other wave-making machine of this kind that I would ever know was Michael Hutchins. It was as if you could feel their presence rippling through the city from the moment their flight hit the tarmac and they entered, half in secret, into our closed little world. When I knocked on the door of what looked like an old garage, a key was hurled to the road with a vaguely familiar shout hovering invisibly on the Sunday afternoon air. As I let myself in, I heard footsteps on the wooden ceiling and the creak of a trapdoor above. At the top of the ladder-like stairs that rolled down to meet me with a thud, there was now a hole in the ceiling where Nick Cave himself stood, bathed in backlight. He beckoned me upwards like an awful figure in a B-grade horror film about a journalist come to interview a terrifying rock and roll vampire. I gulped and set forth on my way to meet my Nosferatu. Once I arrived upstairs, the atmosphere changed immediately. Kay was a solicitous host, while a young woman I took to be his partner bossed him about as if I had just entered a goth version of the British comedy George and Mildred. "Get Mark something to eat, Nick," she said briskly. A large serving of the very best fruits was put before me: grapes, lychees, melon, apple, all prepared and presented in a grand manner. As Kay was about to seat himself and enjoy some of this banquet, his partner said, "Did you offer Mark some coffee, Nick?" Again he rose, mock lugubrious, stick insect angular. He went over to an old metal funnel attached to a wooden workbench, poured in some coffee beans and began to slowly turn a handle. "Grind, grind, grind, it's the story of my life." With a variety of expensive biscuits now also arrayed before me, I was soon thanking the couple for their surprising hospitality. Cave asked me why it should be so unexpected. An evasive answer seemed tactically unwise. So I mentioned the Prince of Darkness thing around him and his reputation for treating journalists poorly. "Who says that?" he asked, a little surly. "Why, the new musical Express," I began to say, in reference to the influential British music paper of the day. "The NME," he barked. Cave began to grind the coffee beans with much greater intensity. His partner looked at me and said, "Don't get him started." To Cave, she called out in a calming voice, "Now, Nick." Cave ground on, taking it out on the beans. "The NME." Finally, he came back over to us with a large silver coffee pot, steaming with his efforts. A set of fine china cups were ready on a matching silver serving tray. Mid-pour, Cave lost focus, the coffee slowly streaming out of the spout and around, but not into the cups in an ever-widening circle, the tray filling with black liquid as if it were a swimming pool, until he snapped back into consciousness and finally found the cups as well. Completing the task at last, Cave then asked me with all the decorum he could muster, "Would you like milk or sugar with that?" The next 2.5 hours felt rather like an interview taking place under similar dark water. Each question seemed to demand huge reservoirs of concentration from Cave, not to mention frequent pauses and micro sleeps. Cave's sometimes thin and creaky, sometimes sonorous and self-consciously refined speaking voice certainly had its hypnotic qualities. I felt suspended, unsure of what to do or even how to leave. To be honest, I'm not sure the encounter ever quite ended, so much as faded away. With everyone heavily relaxed, I departed once more through the floor. I should say Nick was a much more alert guy in the later stages of the process, though. But I couldn't resist the comedy of that encounter.
So, speaking about the later stages of the process, I was really fascinated by the point that you kind of talked around a couple of times. Once near the start, you wrote this section, and it's about the biographer's relationship to the subject. You wrote, "As a biographer, I came to define the cloudy territory I found myself in as akin to a working friendship. I understood that when the work was over, the friendship would likely pass. Though, of course, as you get to know people over time, things are never so straightforward." So, things never being so straightforward. How did your relationship with Nick develop over? Okay, first question: how long did it take to write this book? I guess.
Well, that's a sort of nebulous, strange question in itself. So, 10 years or so. But in terms of actual writing, probably about half that time. And then the other half was this very kind of fucked up kind of middle period where I busted up with my partner at the time and was kind of going through a sort of, well, you don't recognise breakdown because breakdown suggests something like that, whereas a sort of a disintegration or change in your life can actually be a very kind of incremental and zigzaggy process that's positive as well as negative. But there were definitely a few kind of lost years there, and I was having to deal with just practical stuff like where the hell am I going to live, how am I going to make a living, these kind of things. So that just living got in the way of writing a biography about someone else's life. But I always knew the work was good. In fact, and I had an original publisher for it who told me at the time that they thought it was some of the best non-fiction writing they'd ever seen. But the problem was I'd launched into what would be an attempt to do a full A to Z total life story of Nick. And he just keeps producing and moving and working, and you know, like you turn around, he's got a new film out, you scratch yourself, he's written a novel, you know, you go to call him up and he's got an album coming out, and then he's toured the world, and then he's sort of selling tea towels to you from cave things. It's just like, it's just unbelievable, his work ethic. So I couldn't keep up as well with the sort of deluge of content from him. And I started to think more that I wanted to do this thing of doing a rites of passage coming of age story, but my original publisher didn't want that. So that began to cause a lot of problems for me as well. So it was like this sort of compound of my literary ambitions, my personal life, and just economic practicalities that just stretched the whole thing out. And I'd actually lost control of my material because it was locked up with my previous publisher, and I didn't own the work anymore. So I had to get the work back, and a lawyer friend helped me to do that because there was another publisher in the wings that wanted it. So there's a whole convoluted backstory that's about much more than just the writing. And the new publisher I got, which was HarperCollins Australia, were just fantastic. Their editors were great. They totally understood the project. They supported the vision that I had, and the book emerged and has been very successful, and I've had rave reviews here and in the UK and also in the USA, where it's just emerged too, which has been great. But there's a funny bittersweet energy to it because there was a lot of damage and struggle for me along the way, and my original solution and most of what I had already done is pretty much how it was 5-6 years ago. I mean, I've polished it, I've improved it, and definitely working with HarperCollins editors, I've made it sharper and better, and often it's that last 5% in the editing and rewriting that can turn a book from good to great, and I think that's what happened. But the sense that I was on the right track, it was like, it's kind of, I kind of went the long way around the mountain. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, I just went off on a whole tangent there, but yeah, it was, the work was in my life as much as in the work itself. But I think all books are like that. A great book, which is what I wanted it to be, you have to invest the nature of who you are. There has to be a belief and a feeling from you to the work, a sense of presence, that the words mean something to you, and that you mean something with the words. You know, I remember reading this interview with Cormac McCarthy, and he said, if you're not willing to kill yourself over a book, then it's no good. I thought, oh, that's a little bit severe. But I did actually kind of relate to it in some respects, you know.
Sounds like quite a journey. I wanted to dig in a little bit to some of the influences on Nick Cave's career, life, and his art that you so elegantly tease out in the book. Firstly, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about Nick's relationship with his father, because you really kind of get into that.
Yeah, well, it was, Nick was a very, unsurprisingly, pretty strong individual, even as a boy and a young man, more so. His father was quite a titan himself, and if Nick hadn't become the figure that he's become, I think, in some circles at least, he might be regarded as the son of Colin Cave, because his father was quite a life-changing teacher wherever he went. His father was a theatre director. He worked with the Melbourne Theatre. But his father was really a kind of educational visionary, particularly in relation to adult education. And he set up the Adult Education Centre in Wangaratta. He was trying to transform the nature of adult education across the state of Victoria. He was trying to actually make Wangaratta a focus for a regional university. That didn't happen. So he was lobbying on all those kind of levels. And he also was a Ned Kelly obsessive. He was obsessed with the outlaw, and that was a big influence on Nick too. And Colin Cave actually ran a big symposium in the late 60s in Wangaratta about Ned Kelly, and academics and historians and other figures came to it. Manning Clark, the great sort of narrative Australian historian, was there. And I always forget the writer's name, but the guy who wrote the main biography of Ned Kelly read all these papers and was very influenced by them, and he was especially influenced by Colin Cave's paper from that symposium. And the book of Ned Kelly that was written was then an influence on Peter Carey's book, The True History of the Kelly Gang, which was then made into a film which starred amongst its cast Nick Cave's son, Earl, as one of the Kelly Gang. So there's this funny sort of cyclical history going on. And there are sort of images related to the Ned Kelly mythology in Nick Cave's work, with the sort of the violence, the outlaw thing that affected the film The Proposition, early birthday party songs like Dead Joe, which is partly about Joe Byrne, as well as Nick fantasising about his own kind of sadomasochistic things. So the Ned Kelly myth filtered right through Nick and all of this came through his father, right? And then there's other stuff which is more emotional, which was the combat between father and son. And because Nick was basically beginning to turn into a juvenile delinquent, he was basically a brilliant young boy who was getting more troublesome because he was just bloody well bored. His father and his mother, Dawn, decided it was best to send him away to Melbourne to boarding school. And Nick was very wounded by that, very hurt. He felt kind of banished from Wangaratta. And Wangaratta still is a kind of dreaming place for him in terms of the river there, the ovens and the town and that boyhood space that was sort of idyllic for him. Because at boarding school there was bullying, there was a lot more violence, and there was a sort of shift in his whole identity. And he kept struggling with his father's influence throughout, and just doing what young men do sometimes, which is to be just a real pain in the arse.
And of course his father died when he was, 19?
He was 21. He often said in many interviews he was 19. And I think when we experience trauma or a difficult thing, we don't mean to lie, but we tend to see ourselves as younger than we are because it's hurt us so much. And that's just one little indicator that Nick would often say he was 19 when in fact he was 21 when his father died. So he's still quite young. It was just before they recorded the second side of the Door album. and his father died in a car accident, and it happened out of the blue. Nick at that stage had been arrested not long before for some petty crime stuff and vandalism, and the news actually arrived when Nick's mother was with him at the police station because of this vandalism, petty crime thing, and the cops were interviewing him, and suddenly the news arrives that his father's been killed in a car accident. So here's Nick in a police station in St Kilda, which is not a very pleasant place at the end of the 1970s, let me tell you, with his mother who's getting this traumatic news that his father's been killed, and Nick has been nothing but big time trouble to both his parents. So there's all this unresolved parental hurt that he's caused, and for Nick a sense of never getting to resolve the frictions with his father. And that's almost the atomic moment when Nick really is not the beginning of the transformation and the obsessions that come to do with sort of death and the anger that's been kind of burning away really gets very intense with the birthday party. All that stuff happens through the accident. I actually write about the accident in the book that killed his father, and it's a chapter, it probably sounds a bit morbid, that I'm really proud of, but I did research in Wangaratta. I interviewed Colin Cave's peers at the school, people who taught and worked with him. I actually did the drive that was along the road, country dirt road, that ended up killing Colin Cave, and where he ran off the road as near as I could. It was the same type of year. By coincidence, I read the autopsy reports that included interviews with the police that found the body. I interviewed the guy who was a fellow teacher of Colin Cave's that had to identify the body. I obviously interviewed Dawn Cave, Colin Cave's wife, Nick Cave's mother. I spoke to Nick. I spoke to all the band and the people around about the impact of that death on Nick. And I basically recreate the death drive of Colin Cave in the book. But I think some people read it and think I've just imagined it, but there was a lot of work in that, and for me it's as a sort of piece of creative non-fiction. It's as near factual as one could make it while trying to also present it in novelistic terms.
Such a vivid passage, that passage, the drive. But I didn't know you did that. Yeah, great.
Well, in fact, I nearly came off the road myself, weirdly, which was kind of chilling, because it's, those dirt roads and the gradients curved, and, like if you're only going at 40k and you just slide to one side, it's pretty easy if you don't. And Colin Cave was known as a bit of a lead foot as well. So, he would have been bolting along.
You talked just then, and it's obvious through reading the book how many people you've spoken to over that time of researching the book. There's multiple points of view about a bunch of things that happened there. Was it hard to feel like you were doing everybody justice or being fair to everybody while still telling what you believed was the true story of particular events?
Yeah, it was hard. I think conflicting versions of things are fine. Like, that was actually in some ways a thrill to me, to have 3 or 4 opposing or at least different variations on what occurred at an incident, because then you can kind of surround a moment kaleidoscopically and create something that's still kind of febrile and alive. And through those sort of contesting accounts, there was a lot of stuff to do with memory in the book, where people would be talking about stuff and it was as if the events were still alive in them as they talked about them. So in a way, I found that the differences were helpful to me as a storyteller, and was able to take advantage of them. But there are ethical things as well. When someone's as famous as Nick Cave, I wasn't so much worried about, for instance, pleasing Nick with the book, although he did say he was surprised how much he liked it. But I was more concerned the sort of collateral damage you can do to people that are not famous when someone famous has moved through their lives. And that's a really difficult area to manage. And the other thing you're doing, I mean, it sounds pretentious, but I wanted the book to be like a Dostoevsky novel or something where, because you've got about 20 major characters and then a bunch of people who are not as important. So there's a huge cast in the book and I need you to remember everybody. So if I introduce a person on page 24 and then I reintroduce them on page 270 and then they appear at a glimpse on page 425, I need you to recall them at every time. So that requires a degree of drama where they say something interesting, sensational or funny, where they do something stupid, beautiful or whatever. And no matter how hard you try, you're really boiling an individual down to 2 or 3 archetypal moments. And that's a very confronting thing for a person to see themselves reduced to. And most people were happy. I had 1 or 2 people that were not so happy with me. I'm thinking about one person in particular who threatened to sue me and never did. They were mostly angry that I quoted them accurately. It wasn't the detail wasn't the problem. Like, I didn't get it wrong. It was because I got it right and I quoted them. But
they regretted what they had said.
Yeah, they did. But then they would go and say the same things again to someone else. It's just like, well, and it was too good not to quote, but it also gets into the differences in time as well. Like, I can see a few familiar faces out there, and I think about that period of the 70s and the 80s, punk and post-punk, where that new Pistols series about the Sex Pistols, the whole thing of aggression, sarcasm, sardonic flavours, confrontation in how we negotiated our lives socially, and those kind of energies and the sense of actually saying sometimes just being downright nasty, right? But also sort of shaking everything up and looking. It's a very different time now. So when people their actions and their words from that time are cited now, there's a real unease about how it looks, and it can be hard contextually to sort of understand the cultural differences. And I tried to put that context in, that what was going on. There was a cultural shift happening, and there were all kinds of frictions occurring, and Nick and all these other figures were born out of those frictions in exciting ways. It's not to say it was a nice time, but it was certainly an exciting time. But I think it is hard now to sometimes understand that. Maybe particularly for people who are younger, I'd hope I was able to present enough information for it to be clear. But I didn't kind of make moral value judgments one way or another and stand behind a certain moment and wave my finger saying this was so awful or whatever. I just tried to let the information stand for itself.
And to continue on that point there, I guess, aside from the people who you're saying may have been big players in their life, obviously there's those major players as well, and it's well known that Nick's had these very intense creative partnerships over his life with Roland S. Howard and Anita Lane and later than this book, but Blixer and other people like that. And there's this kind of idea that you come back to a couple of times in the book there that kind of goes back to Dostoevsky, doesn't it, about Nick being kind of ruthless, or there being some kind of ruthlessness to succeed in his creative vision.
Yeah.
Well, do you have to be ruthless to be a good artist?
I think there certainly has to be an element of that in you, for sure. Maybe that could be, from the artist's point of view, a type of monomania, and other people see you as ruthless, but you're just obsessed. I don't think Nick was just ruthless, and also we change over time too. Like, Nick was turning into a very angry young man. He was beginning to become a heroin addict by the time he'd left Australia. Like, there's a lot of not very pretty things occurring. He was also, on the verge of just finding his voice, his first expressive voice as a great artist with The Birthday Party. So, I don't know, to say he's just ruthless is not fair, because Nick could be very kind, he could be very gracious. I mean, we're all full of these paradoxes and contradictions in our life, all the ways through our life. I think what interested me more was those paradoxes and contradictions, that Nick in one moment could be quite, say, misogynistic in his lyrics. Then he could turn around and be quite sort of noble and heroic in defending a female friend to another male friend who was being quite nasty and foul. Then he could be quite sort of loving and tender with his mother, and also be carrying the kind of shame of his drug addiction and the pain. So there are multiple levels to just his relationship with women, for example, good, bad, and in between. And it seems to me, again, we're in an age where people want these almost like cartoons of what people are. And people, particularly someone like Nick, who's has lived a big life. I just think people are many things. And a part of that multiple nature, what interested me was the influence of other people on him. So, like you're saying, like there was Roland S. Howard, there was his partner Anita Lane, who he wrote songs with, and who basically styled him and made clothes for him, who wrote lyrics with him, who affected his taste in books, who was a superb painter and artist herself. And who was with him, right through into the sort of Berlin years, influencing him in many, many ways and collaborating with him. And then you had someone like Mick Harvey, who he'd met at school, who was his first sort of great musical partner, who could sort of ended up being able to play every instrument under the sun, who helped sort of produce most of the albums going through, or co-produce most of the albums going through the 80s and the 90s, who at different times was managing the band, who was sort of dealing with all their drug problems and keeping them out of scrapes as well, who was booking the studios. And, like it's been said before, that there would be no Nick Cave without Mick Harvey, right? So Nick, for all his brilliance, is a social product of these people and these times, and he's always had an astute ability to not just exploit, but to marshal and inspire talent around him. And Mick Harvey talks about this as well. Like he gets insulted when people come up to him in the street and treat him like he was some dupe of Nick's, that, oh, Nick ripped you off, or Nick used you. It's like, what do they think? I am an idiot? Like, I could see that Nick was a brilliant artist, and I chose to work with him, and he put up with a lot of shit as well, because of Nick's talent, because Nick was also fun to be with, and because they went as far as they did together. And there are lots of smaller players in that narrative as well. And I think it goes back to Nick's childhood in Wangaratta, his sort of first sweetheart who played him, Leonard Cohen's Songs of Love and Hate, and his childhood friend Brian Wellington I talked to, and not just their influence in an overt way, but the feelings that they had, the dreams that they shared, that some never got to realise, and Nick became a kind of avatar for dreams they had and dreams that they never were able to realise. So there's a funny sort of pain there again when someone becomes famous, that I don't know, that's that sort of that God-shaped hole idea. There's some... The presence of a person long after they've gone stays with you, because you hear them on the radio, you see stories on them in the paper, and your life is marked as a chapter or a sentence even just in their life, and you think, wow, well, how did that happen? How did I become just a small ray of light in someone else's moon, you know?
It's very well known that Nick's a literary man, and he's talked about a lot of his influences, and you kind of drill into those in the book. Lolita being a particular one. Dostoevsky, you already mentioned. There was one in there that you kind of mentioned maybe twice that really surprised me, and I really thought about it and I really liked it, and that was Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah. Is that did Nick mention that, or was that your connection?
God, I have to look at the book and find out. Actually, well, yeah, Nick's pretty, eclectic kind of guy, you know, and I think all kinds of works affected him. I mean, as you're speaking, like Bowie keeps popping up into my mind, and I don't think, except for the early phase with The Boy Next Door, he sounded like Bowie and Dylan. But what he learnt from because when we talk about influence, there's a tendency to think about influence as a sound-alike or write-alike thing. But I think what he learnt from Bowie and Dylan was a conceptual freedom, and that was to move forward as an artist and to keep shape-shifting. Like, that's the influence of Bowie, and to not be afraid to experiment, and to not be afraid of failure, and to not be afraid of losing your audience and finding new audiences. So that's the influence of those two artists, for example. I think rather than, well, Where the Wild Things Are is in there, but obviously it was more Flannery O'Connor, and William Faulkner was coming into play. And Nick was also, I mean, he studied at art school in Melbourne after he finished grammar school. So he was a huge Brett Whiteley fan. In fact, he said he wanted to be like Brett Whiteley. So you can see the attractions too, like Brett Whiteley was this sort of rock and roll, heroin, artist, wild man, and Nick as a 70-year-old thought Brett Whiteley was the bee's knees. But he didn't just like Whiteley because of that, he liked Whiteley because of the refined and elegant abilities that Whiteley had. And in many ways, the funny thing about Nick as an artist, I think, is on the one hand, there's this image of this, particularly back in the birthday party days, this sort of anarchic rock and roll animal. And yet in so many ways, Nick's a stylist and very obsessed with image and theatre, which comes again through his father, and very refined appearances. So Nick's very in control of those things. He's not a totally chaotic being, and he may have been in his personal life, but I think he's always been aware of channeling it into form. He always knew that he had to find forms.
Looking back through your work, Mark, I came across that piece of yours that I think I read many years ago called The Electrified Journalist, that I think you named your blog after, which is a really interesting, is it an essay?
It's kind of essay, memoir.
Where you kind of talk about that idea of rock and roll being about more than musicians, about writers in that space, and Woody Guthrie and Ginsberg and Lester Bangs, and I just wondered if that really struck me as something that both kind of flows into that book and flows into your own work. And
yeah, for sure. Look, I really, it's a bit of a corny comparison, but I always love watching, about once every 5 years, Almost Famous, because it reminds me of how I started, because I started when I was in my late teens, and that whole Daggy thing, and everybody else is so cool, and I remember going to do interviews with people and have sweaty palms and have 30 questions worked out, and I just wouldn't listen to anything anybody said because I just had the page practically nailed to my forehead. I used to hate, but I grew to love interviews and love conversations, and I was lucky. It was a sort of good time to enter into rock journalism because there were so many publications around. But I always wanted my work to be literary, but to have that kind of rock and roll kind of energy. And I hope the book is a successful example of that it's not just a biography or an historical work, but it is still a rock and roll work, and the energy of the music and the people kind of surges through it in the way I tell the story. And I want all my work to be like that. And a part of that's conscious, but a part of it is very unconscious as well. If you're listening to certain types of music, the lyrics and the energy of the music kind of forms the way you move, the way you write, whether you're using short sentences or long sentences, the language. And I think that the sense of writing as a performance on the page, like I've always been conscious of that. You want to be interesting. Like, people don't read you because they have to, like, this is good for you. You need to have a kind of a persuasive, charming, confrontational, bizarre, poetic, whatever it is, to maintain the momentum of interest. And it may be too, I mean, you don't want to exceed yourself, even though that opening chapter was me talking about meeting Nick. After that, I'm not there. You can feel my presence in the storytelling in terms of choice of adjectives, certain critical perspectives, but I knew people didn't want me there throughout the book. They're interested in Nick, they're interested in the time, so I moved right back. And at some level I couldn't say I'm objective, but I'm certainly just the storyteller, and I want your focus on the story and the people, and I want it to be cinematic. So I want people to sort of move in and out. So there were those type of things too that I was sort of aware of playing with, the sense of a close-up, and then the sense of more of a panorama in terms of context. I just wanted to be a great writer and to write great books, and really, every time I've written a story, whether it's for some street magazine in my 20s, a live review, or working on book projects, I wanted every single thing to matter, and just to be alive, to not sort of die on the page, so to speak, but for it to have some pulse. And rock and roll, I think, at its best is like that. You feel something, particularly in the live arena, that's transformative. And I guess I just wanted to have that ritual in the experience of reading.
Well, you've certainly achieved that in this one. Well, in many of your things, or all of your things probably, but this is such a standalone, such an amazing work. I think it's time we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience, if anybody has them.
So we've got 10 minutes for questions, so anyone, I'll bring the mic out if anyone's got one. Cool, we'll start. You want first?
At the start of the process, do you need to get permission to write about a person?
No, you don't. I would have felt a bit funny though to have had Nick be utterly opposed to it. Although at the start, I forget if I said, he did say no. So that was a bit like, well, that's a bit of a nuisance because I've got about 5 publishers busting me to do it. What am I going to do now? Luckily for me, he read particularly an essay I wrote about The Road and John Hillcoat, and he did the music for The Road. That was the film that John Hillcoat made, and he really liked that a lot, and his management got back in contact with me. And then when I spoke to Nick, he told me that he really liked how even my writing was. So that was, which was high praise from him. But I don't think you have to. I never saw the book, I think I mentioned this before, I never saw the book as something where I needed to please Nick. I figured he could roll with the punches. But I didn't want to, I didn't want it to be a hagiography, and I didn't want it to be like a sort of a hatchet job, what they call a pathography, where because there were a few difficult patches towards the end with Nick, that I'd turn around and take my revenge on him and stick the knife in. And in actual fact, the weird thing about the progress of the book was that in talking to people, people were very sort of nervous as to whether it had Nick's approval or whether I was just Nick's flunky that was going to write a biography. So the general vibe from people, particularly in the Melbourne scene, was, well, I hope you've got Nick's approval, or I hope you're going to stick it to him good and proper. And it's like, well, maybe I can move in a more middle, critical, objective light, and I don't have to annihilate him or kiss his feet, you know? But that just seemed to be beyond the ken of people's imagination. So the answer is no, you don't need to, but it's a little more comfortable if a person's not because it's their life, their story.
Thanks for your objective light, Mark. I've always loved your writing, as you know, and it's always been a pleasure. You know, when you're writing for Rolling Stone or Black and White magazine, oh, I've got Mark Mordue, fantastic. And having worked with Nick for years later, and coming from New Zealand, I was totally unaware of any of his, well, to a degree. I mean, I knew some of it, but... so it's been a brilliant book. It's a beautiful book. When I was at UNE studying literature, I read another book of yours, a non-fiction book, which was on the curriculum, Death Train.
Oh yeah, my travel book
Yeah.
too, which I'm still really proud of.
Yeah, and I just love your writing, and I'm just here to tell them how great he is, really. Nick and I always on the road used to talk about literature. We used to always discuss literature, never music. He was always a gentleman, beautiful man. Are you planning to write any more books on any interesting people?
Oh, right, okay. Well, I'm definitely I'm just about in the process of signing a contract with HarperCollins. It's been a bit of a drawn-out process, not for any bad reasons, just COVID as much as anything kind of complicating things. So I'm going to do a volume 2 of the Nick Cave biography, and it's going to be called Dark Star, and it's Dark Star, Nick Cave in London, Berlin and Sao Paulo. So that's going to be, yeah, it won't be available next week. So that's a few years away, and in the meantime, HarperCollins have also signed me to a novel that I've handed in a manuscript for, and that should come out late next year, and that's going to be called There's No Telling. It's sort of about an accident, and because one of the things that happened to me writing the Nick Cave biography is because my life got sort of upended in so many ways. I had all this work that I was moving towards bringing out that I couldn't get out because I was sort of blocked in the publishing process, because there was a loose understanding from my original publisher that I wouldn't publish a novel or anything else till the Nick Cave book was done. And then when that got all messy, I suddenly had a novel on the back burner, poetry, all. So I'm like this sort of damned creature, but as in not damned to hell, although there was a little bit of that, but damned as in blocked. I've just got all this stuff. So it's weird. Like I'm 62 and I'm just sort of bursting with all this stuff that's been happening, you know. So you know, it was. I wouldn't wish it on people, but you know, crashing my own car in the metaphysical sense was it's been good for me as a writer. You know, like I kind of smashed out of one life into another.
Any more questions? Oh, go ahead.
Mark, I have a friend who worked in drama. He was a teacher initially, and then he decided that he wanted to go around to the schools and do circuses and do that sort of be in the creative field. And I can remember his father saying to him, "When are you going to get a proper job?" Have you ever struck that with your parents? Did they ever say to you, "When are you going to get a proper job?"
No, actually, like I'm from a working class Newcastle background. My parents always backed me 150%, probably more than I backed myself even. They always seemed to have total confidence that I knew what I was doing. And in a way I did, but I think writing, it's kind of, it's not easy for other people in your life, but it becomes part of your character. It's who you are, and you're driven by sort of love and compulsion. So you kind of, I think is it Kafka or someone like that who says you have to push your boat so far out you can't turn back, and that kind of happened to me. And I'm not sure that's always been the wisest thing, and more money would be good, but I've had a lot of freedom, so that's usually the trade-off. But listening to the question, I thought you were going to ask me about Nick, because amongst Nick's father's stuff, he was a theatre director, and he directed a lot of Shakespeare plays, and Shakespeare's the drama of Nick as a performer. That's another influence from Nick's father. And I want to say too, Nick's mother, Dawn Cave, who was a fucking great human being, who only passed away a year or two ago, was an extremely important influence on Nick. A librarian, someone who you could sit down and talk to about Auden and T.S. Eliot, a really nice sense of humour. When I used to go down to Melbourne, I'd be interviewing everybody down there in a frenzy for 3 or 4 days. And I'd go around to Dawn's place. You know, she'd make me a cup of tea and biscuits and sandwiches. I'd just hang out at her place all afternoon, not just because I was wanting to do a story on doing stuff on Nick, but just because she was such nice company, and it was a real respite for me, like a little oasis, and she made me feel at home. I used to joke, oh, look, Dawn, I'll move in eventually, you know, just stay here. And I think, you know, all of us are products of our family, and I think it's a bit generalised and maybe even corny, but I think Nick's drive, his performing energy, his will, his dominating presence at times comes from his father, and his warmth and his humour and his sort of poetic inclinations, they come from his mother. And that was something I just learned through the time that I spent with Dawn. And in a way, she became like a second mum to me as well, you know, which was really nice. Like, she always was encouraging to me as well. And she died just before the book came out, which I felt awful about, that if I was nervous of anybody's judgment on the book, it would have been Nick's mother, Dawn, because I would have hated her to not like it. Hated her to not like it.
Well, that unfortunately brings to an end a fantastic session. Please thank Steve Coates and Mark Mordue. And the usual drill applies. Yes, Mark will be going to the book area where you can